Hello, my name is Simon Klein and I'm EMVCo's Director of Communications. I'd like to briefly welcome you to this webinar that's being hosted by EMVCo and APSCA. I'm just going to get things going. I'm going to take you on to just take you through a few housekeeping instructions. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So, during this webinar, you're going to hear from our panelists, but at the end of the webinar, we've allowed time for questions to the panelists, and we would positively encourage you to submit questions for them to answer. You can submit those questions during the discussion that's going to be taking place, and then when we get to the question and answer session, Greg Pope from APSCA will go through the questions and pose them to the panelists for you. If during the webinar you experience any technical issues, please put a question in the question box and we'll answer that. You can find the question option on your right-hand side panel. Alternatively, what we often find with such webinars is if you are getting particular problems, log out and log back in. Now I'm going to move on to hand you over to Greg Pope from APSCA, who's going to introduce you to our panelists. Over to you, Greg.
Thanks, Simon. Good morning, everyone who's not in Asia, and good afternoon, everybody who's in the Asia Pacific region. So my name is Greg Pope. I'm the moderator for this webinar today. I'm the chairman of APSCA. APSCA is an industry organization for payments and identity based in Asia. And I think that's all I need to say about APSCA. Many of the people on this call should be familiar with APSCA. And we're delighted to be organizing this webinar with EMVCo. It's not the first time we've done this, and we've done some interesting webinars with EMVCo before. And this is a very important subject, looking at e-commerce payment fraud in the Asia Pacific region. So let me move on and introduce our panelists here today on the webinar. So firstly, Arman Aycan is the EMVCo Director of Technology. Arman is EMVCo's Director of Technology, balancing his time between key EMVCo technical priorities. He's responsible for the oversight of the technical development across EMVCo's multiple working groups, as well as the activities related to product approvals and evaluations. Arman also represents EMVCo as part of the organization's engagements with other technical bodies, helping to ensure effective collaboration and industry alignment, which is, of course, integral to the evolution of EMVCo's technical initiatives. He's had senior technology leadership positions across the US, Europe, and Asia, including roles at FEAM and UL. And in those roles, he was responsible for leading payments innovation and strategic relationship management with the global payment brands. So moving on, Hans-Peter Gisler is the Managing Director for Netcetera in Singapore. Hans-Peter has over 30 years of experience in the financial industry, 9 years in the payments industry. He joined Netcetera 5 years ago at the headquarters in Switzerland, and he moved to Singapore about 2 years ago. So in Singapore, Hans-Peter is responsible for the entire APAC market and the local team in Singapore. And the last of our panelists, Andy White, is the CEO of the Australian Payments Network, and which is otherwise known as AusPayNet. And AusPayNet is the Australian payments industry self-regulatory body. Andy has 25 years international experience incorporating roles at the Bank of England, LCH, ClearNet, and the Australian Securities Exchange. He also holds advisory roles on the Payment Card Industry Security Standards Council, EMVCo, the Emerging Payments Association of Asia, and the editorial board of the Journal of Payment Strategy and Systems. So those are our panelists here today, and we're going to take different responsibilities throughout the webinar. So I think now we can move on to look at one of the key questions of this webinar. What types of e-commerce payment fraud are most common in the Asia Pacific region? So APAC has a diverse online payments ecosystem, and That makes it more vulnerable, perhaps, to a broader range of risks on top of classic payment card fraud. Consumers across Southeast Asia have access to many alternative payment systems, including mobile wallets, real-time payment solutions, often from national schemes, bank transfers, and even starting to see digital currencies in addition to payment cards. With the size and diversity of the region, there are always going to be market-specific customer behaviors and preferences for online shopping across Asia. I mean, one characteristic that I can think of today is that probably in APAC at this point in time, there are likely to be a larger proportion of customers making e-commerce transactions from their mobile devices than perhaps in other global regions. If you agree or disagree with me on that, you can post a chat or a question in the chat box, and we'll come back to that in the Q&A later on. But now I think we're going to move on to the next slide, and I'm going to ask Hans-Peter to address this question, and we'll hear from him. Hans-Peter, over to you.
Thank you so much, Greg. Yes, as you might know, we are in Singapore for over 3 years now, and we already had customers in the APAC region before. So let's dive into the types of e-commerce payment frauds we see in the region. First of all, we have here on the list, we have email phishing and fraud. What does it mean? So there are an increasing number of very professional attempts of imitating emails from large institutions to fish for information, also for credit card details. I remember the time when we taught our employees and also the consumers to look for some typical indicators in mails, such as spelling errors or requests for immediate actions or even threats. It's not so much the case anymore. They are getting more and more professional. And this is not just in APAC, but this is a very common thing in all the markets where we work. Then the second thing is fake web shops or page hijacking, so copies of pages. Also very common in other regions, not just in APAC. However, the number and the professional design in APAC is very impressive. Call center and social engineering as a topic. Frauds are very international in all the regions. However, we see many call centers here in the region which work very professionally, which means that they are actually appearing to be legal companies, and they are very often in customer support service. We also see Trojan fraud. This is also a way to direct to fake web shops or to call centers, or might even ask for OTPs and passwords, or simply spy for credit card information. Then we have account takeovers. Those are a bit more prominent in APAC than in other regions. This is at least what we see, as many wallets and issuing apps here in the region are only protected with user and password, or in best case with an OTP, which is then usually SMS or email. The SIM swap fraud, which means that SIM is pretty much copied and allows to receive OTPs or initial passwords. And SMS is not secure by design. This is certainly one of the main sources of fraud in the region. Something I got to know only in this region is QR code fraud. QR codes are very common in various countries in APAC to initiate a payment, or sometimes even in a restaurant, to initiate order and payment. Increasingly, such QR codes are used to direct to a malicious page. QR is mostly not present in other markets. That's why this kind of fraud is not so common.
Hans-Peter, that's very interesting. I mean, apart from the last category, QR code fraud, which I don't think has been much exposure outside of the Asia Pacific, for the rest of these categories, I mean, if you compare Asia Pacific, let's say, with Europe, are you seeing any major differences between the regions?
That's actually a tough question because APAC market is a large market, and unlike Europe, not one market with one regulation. Well, although Europe claims that it has some national flavors as well, right? Nevertheless, the challenges are therefore very individual. However, I would say there is a common denominator, and that's the OTP topic I mentioned earlier. Still, many countries rely on SMS or email for their OTPs. SMS and emails can be easily intercepted. That's something we know. For instance, as I mentioned before with the SIM swap. And on top of this, the same authentication, as I mentioned earlier, is also used in many cases for issuing apps and wallets. And then again, we are in this account takeover. So the European regulation forced the market participants to abandon SMS, email, and such type of fraud reduced a lot. We'll have a live demo later on OOB on how to address such a topic. On the other hand, fake web shops, email phishing, and call center fraud is comparable to Europe. This professional design of campaigns, if we call it campaigns, makes it very hard to deal with. And again, as I said earlier, QR is very unique to the region. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. Now we're going to move on to another of our panelists, Andy White. He's going to give us some perspective on fraud in Australia. Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Craig, and I'll maybe pick up on a couple of points that Hans-Peter raised as well. This slide, which is based on the fraud statistics that we publish at AusPayNet for Australia, really emphasises why we're talking about e-commerce. I think Australia is a classic market where, because we were early adopters of chip and pin, chip at ATM, both EMVCo initiatives and also early adopters of biometrics through digital wallets. Really, card present fraud is now at minimal levels. So we're now at the point where 91% of the card fraud that we see is card not present, and therefore e-commerce. So we're rightly sort of focused on that. Just to add a couple of points to the ones that Hans-Peter raised. I mean, I think in terms of that fraud, the other things that we see are the link between large-scale data breaches, often because of cybersecurity attacks, and card not present fraud. That's obviously a key reason why card data is available for misuse. And the other point they're talking of misuse is first-party misuse. So what used to get called friendly fraud, again, is a pretty major factor. And just to emphasize another point that Hans-Peter made there, I mean, I think the focus on one-time passwords, and we might talk about this later in terms of lessons learned from other jurisdictions. I think where that kind of authentication drives to one-time passwords through SMS, it can actually add to the issue because those SMSs can get intercepted. We're certainly seeing increasingly, and not unique to Australia, I think of places like Malaysia, the provision of that OTP going in-app, certainly in terms of what the financial institutions are using, and therefore being secure within that app environment that the customer is familiar with.
Okay, thanks, Andy. I'm going to drag you in here, Armin. I mean, to what extent do you think that the chart and what Andy has been saying reflects card fraud globally?
I think it's a very insightful point, as we have seen since the early adoption of the chip cards. And we can see how these have been adopted at different speeds throughout the regions. And we could really see the impact that it had on those fraud statistics, the more the chip cards were adopted, the more difficult it was to be able to do face-to-face fraud, and fraudsters moved to online. And as we see global adoption of the chip cards, we can also see the same level of card not present fraud numbers rising. And I think the pandemic also was a driver for this, where people can do those frauds from their home, like we were working from home as well. They were working from home too. So I think that's very insightful in terms of what we see in Australia and how it actually relates to the adoption of the more secure technologies that we see throughout the world.
Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, now we're going to ask your opinion. We're going to have a poll here, and the poll is going to look at from a global. It's going to ask you from a global perspective, and I stress that point is globally. What type of e-commerce fraud do you think is the most challenging? So can we move on to the poll? So here's the poll, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to give you about 30 seconds or so to quickly complete this poll. So we're asking you from a global perspective, which type of e-commerce fraud do you think is the most challenging? You can select one of email phishing fraud, fake web shops, page hijacking, Trojan fraud, account takeover, SIM swap fraud. So please make your selection. We'll give you another 15 seconds or so to make that selection, and then we'll close the poll. Right, so operator, I think you can close the poll now and we'll move on. So, okay, let's take a quick look at the results. So most people are saying that they think email phishing fraud is the worst at 34%. Then fake web shops, page hijacking, and account takeover are almost the same at 25 and 24. Further down is Trojan fraud and SIM swap fraud. Yeah, I mean, any comments on that from our panelists?
I would have one which is very timely. Being Swiss, I don't know if you have seen, there's been quite an interesting collaboration between Swatch and Omega, and they had a very limited number of watches being put out. And I've seen an article online to figure out where you could buy them online, and interestingly, that magazine was referencing a fake shop. And I was really surprised when you see the watches being sold at half price. It looked genuine with the Swatch logo and everything. So I would agree that we see them more than we think, and sometimes people don't realize that they are on those sites.
All right, let's move on to the next slide. And so now, having explored the various types of e-commerce payment fraud that we're seeing in APAC, we're now going to take a look at the role that EMV Technologies can play in fighting e-commerce fraud. And I'm going to hand it over to Armin again, EMVCo's Director of Technology, to explore the role that EMV Technologies can play in combating e-commerce fraud. Armin, over to you.
Thank you. So EMVCo's been around for quite a while now, and it all started with the very first implementations of chip technologies, and I think there's a lot to be said towards the level of security that is provided by the specifications and the technologies that are being provided. And a lot of that has influenced the world of connected devices beyond payment. And some of those examples are related to cryptographic evidence and the dynamic checking of the integrity of the card that you are using, rather than the number that is displayed or the MAC stripe that you have on it. And that dynamic verification is also very important to reduce the repeatability of these attacks. Now, our mission is really been to facilitate those card-based payments and enable them to work seamlessly and securely worldwide. So I've briefly touched around the fact that they are very secure, and I think one of the reasons why we see this is the adoption of those and the technologies that are being used. So these specifications have evolved and are promoting this, but if we have all these implementations being done regionally separately, it kind of slows down their adoption, and the seamless aspect is quite important in terms of having the interoperability of these technologies globally. And this is where the approval and evaluation comes into play. We have a very wide array of tools that we use in terms of qualifying products, accredited labs, as well as the approval of the products and the security evaluation of those, in order to basically make sure that they have been consistently implemented towards the specifications, and they're compliant with the specifications and the security guidelines that we have set out. Then the trust comes with the EMVCo marks in order to recognize the different specifications being used. And that includes the contactless logo, the QR code, the SRC click to pay icon, and so forth. So you can have all the list of the different marks in order to bring that familiarity with the different payment methods and technologies that are being provided. And finally, that's something that we're going to touch upon a little bit later on, is the industry engagement and collaboration. My co-panelists are also associates within our organization and provide very meaningful inputs in making sure that those specifications are addressing the real use cases and are addressing the regional needs as well. So these are within the implementation industry, but also within the wider technological landscape with other organizations and technical organizations. So why does it matter? Basically, the trust and peace of mind to know that wherever you go, your card will work seamlessly and securely is very important, and we all benefit from it today. And let's have a look now at how these have evolved over the course of time. So this is a really good animation that is showing all the different technologies that we have on the left-hand side, but also on the right-hand side, the different applications that they enable. So we can pay in store, we can pay remotely, you can authenticate the consumer, the cardholder, you can verify the credentials that are being used, and also securing the payment at the end. And I think now we can have a look at the very specific specifications that are relevant to the conversation we're having today. We have here 3 examples of specifications that can help support e-commerce payments. Payment tokenization is really enhancing the security by reducing the impact of a stolen primary account number. So the card number that you have printed on your card that you use to type when you used to make shopping online with a merchant that you are not registered with. This reduces significantly the impact because we replace it with a token, and that token is limited to the specific environment in which it is being used. We have the secure remote commerce. that also helps fight the friction and complexity. So you don't, card abandonment is a big issue for merchants. And how often will you actually not finalize a purchase because they're asking you to type in your card information, you don't have your wallet, or you can't be bothered, or you don't have the time. So SRC is a really convenient way of reducing this kind of friction. And finally, 3D Secure is a secure customer authentication technology that increases the security of e-commerce payments. And we heard very nicely from Andy and Hans-Peter around the use of OTPs, which can be an unsecured channel if it is used over an SMS. But if you are using the mobile banking application to do an in-app authorization using the 3D Secure specification, this is something that actually helps reduce fraud while increasing the security of e-commerce payments. And I think now it's maybe Hans-Peter, I think a good question for you now would be to see you providing all these three technologies, how you see them being used in isolation or in combination.
Sorry, Armand, I have to answer again the same as before to Greg. It depends. Yes, it really depends on the region. In India, for instance, the network tokenization is already mandated, and there all the participants have it already. On the other hand, we know that Indian merchants still have the grace period until October to switch to 3DS 2.x, whereas in the rest of APAC, things look very different. I would say for us as a solution provider, 3D Secure is usually the product with which we usually establish a new customer relationship. It's like the foundation. Tokenization and click to pay are more of an add-on at a later phase. Not that they are less important, but usually the journey starts with 3D Secure. Only a few customers are only interested in click to pay, whereas more customers ask directly for the tokenization. It might be because of the focus, of the different focus of the product. 3D Secure is a must in many countries for authentication. Click to pay allows to reach more potential customers, and tokenization can increase frictionless and increase security on top of 3D Secure, as you pointed out before. I personally see a strong correlation between SRC and tokenization. Customers who have implemented tokenization for card on file see click to pay kind of a logical next step to the journey, because then they can also reach customers who have the preference of a guest checkout with less friction. Also, the network tokenization is a familiar concept for them. And of course, we see card networks providing discounts for merchants who are operating both on their sites, which also supports the case.
Okay, thanks, Hans-Peter. That's interesting. I think we're going to move on and hear more about payment tokenization on the next slide. Back to you, Armand.
Thank you. So if we go a little bit deeper into the tokenization, and I think some of the use cases have been mentioned in terms of how it helps, is mostly merchants can replace the card on file using the actual card number with something that will be less compromising with reduced impact if there is actually a breach. And the benefit of the token is that it can be bound to a various user environment. So it could be bound to merchant, it could be bound to specific use cases, whether it's transit or other, or it could be bound to specific device. and that's protecting the primary account number that comes with it. But at the same time, some additional benefits can come from it with improved authorization rates through the added security that it provides. And for the cardholders and the issuers is the reduce of the data being compromised thanks to this use case. In terms of the cardholder, there's another benefit that can come from it as well, is the life cycle. So if you have a compromised physical card, you may still be able to use the digital token while your physical card is being replaced. So lots of benefits that come out of it. And I think from here we can possibly see and move to the next specification around EMV Secure Commerce.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just go back to that slide a minute. I'm just going to ask you, do you think payment tokenization is more focused on e-commerce or more focused on face-to-face payments, or both?
I believe it's both, and we have use cases that can show the benefit on both sides. And then in terms of impact, I think we see an increase in remote commerce. So people are getting more familiar or hearing more about the improved benefits that the merchants can provide through the tokenization that they can use for the consumers. But we also see this being used with the different devices that people are using, whether it's their phone or it's their watch or different use cases. So it provides benefits on both sides.
Okay, good. All right, so let's move on to where we were. There we are. Over to you, Armin. And let me just interject here, ladies and gentlemen. I would just remind you that if you'd like to ask us some questions, you don't have to wait for the Q&A. You can be posting them into the chat now as things come up in your mind. You know, if you've got queries, just send us a question in the chat and we'll come back to it later. Back to you, Armin.
Thank you. I believe that secure remote commerce is a solution that will help significantly with one of the biggest challenge that we see at the moment is both the checkout friction and the second one is the complexity within the different ecosystems. I don't know if this is something that any of you within the audience are experiencing, but when you go from one shop to the next, you sometimes have a lot of different alternatives to make your payment at the checkout. It's the checkout button fatigue that some people actually started using. And that's been a problem that's been going on for quite a while. And it's very, very difficult to be able to have an overall orchestration that can actually facilitate the ease and the convenience of the payment the same way you have with a physical terminal. Regardless of the logo on your card, you know it's going to work because it is an EMV technology being used. The same will apply to remote commerce thanks to the click-to-pay solution that is the EMV Secure Remote Commerce specification. The simplicity of how it may be perceived of having a single button that can enable any single card that you are using that you have onboarded onto the solution is generated through a very complex specification in the background that will facilitate in between the different payment systems, the different issuers, and the different merchants. Here you have really a small, abstract, high-level view of the complexity, and I think that's very important to highlight. That when you go into an online retailer that offers this technology, all you have to do is enter your identifier and your password, and then the list of the cards that have been in your wallet will be displayed. And just the same way, if you have experienced any of the mobile application payments, where you have the list of the cards, you choose one, you authenticate yourself, and the transaction goes through together with your payment instrument as well as the shipping address. This is the kind of convenience and simplicity that can be provided on the back of it. And that ecosystem complexity, we have released the third version of the specification, and we're continuing to improve on the user experience, and especially working on the user interface and consumer experience related to the merchant orchestrated checkout at the moment.
Armin, I was just thinking about one topic, if you allow me to quickly add something here.
Yes.
Many of our customers still ask us if SRC will replace 3D Secure. Here is, I think it's important to add here that SRC Click to Pay and 3D Secure are certainly two different things. 3D Secure is the authentication, whereas Click to Pay is earlier in the checkout process and simplifies the guest checkout, basically. I very recently paid my flight tickets using Click to Pay with one click, without friction and no churn, but still, of course, processed to the entire flow of 3D Secure in the background. So these two things coexist. What we also see is Australian consumers are very open to such new ways of checkout. They're also very innovative. And we're currently looking into a case which you would normally consider a card present case. Imagine you're sitting in a restaurant. Some Australian restaurants have introduced NFC during the pandemic for the menu or even for ordering drinks and food. Now, when it comes to the payment, we are exploring Click to Pay and how we could support. Imagine you're there in the order process, you finish your order, and with Click to Pay, you see immediately your cards, the list of your cards directly on that page, and you can simply choose one and pay right away. On top of that, or maybe even more important than just not needing to enter the credit card data, is you don't need to share any more data than absolutely necessary. I had the very same experience in another country in APAC, where I had to fill out 3 screens to get to the same result. And this is exactly where Click to Pay can be used in a use case which is not quite that obvious.
Okay.
I think these are really, really important differentiations that are highlighted, where the SRC is really the card holder identification, just the same way you present your card when you were in store, and 3DS is the strong customer authentication aspect for the authorization of the transaction while you enter your PIN or your biometrics in order to validate that you're the rightful holder of that account. And SRC may work with 3DS or can be used without as well. And you have a variety of authentication options that are available in the specification. Thanks for that comment. I think now we should look at 3DS. That's been mentioned. So 3D Secure is really the strong customer authentication aspect that helps you fight e-commerce fraud while reducing the disruption within the purchasing process. And for issuers, it's basically enhancing the verification of the authenticity of the transaction and fraud management. For the merchants is greater security and reducing friction. And if you are in a regulated environment, if you can benefit from the exemptions, that's also a great benefit in terms of reducing friction. And for consumers is sometimes a safer checkout experience. I've heard sometimes people say that if they don't have that validation aspect where they have to click, they're worried that this might have been a fraudulent transaction. So this trust and safe checkout experience is something that's really important for the consumers as well. So we see this being adopted in Europe. with the European Banking Association that has recognized 3DS as being compliant with PSD2 SCA. And we also have the US Payment Forum in a non-regulated area that is stating that 3DS has significantly reduced fraud while fighting friction. Now, Andy, it would be interesting to see what's the position of Australia with regards to strong customer authentication.
Yeah, thanks, thanks, Simon. And it's interesting your last comment there about regulated environments and unregulated environments. We're probably somewhere in the middle. We're a self-regulated environment, as Greg said at the start. One of our roles is as a self-regulatory body, and we faced into really the fraud numbers that I showed earlier, and that at the time that 91% number was about 85% of card fraud. We recognised that we needed to do something on card not present fraud, e-commerce, back around 2018. And we also recognised that it was an ecosystem problem. So really everyone through from merchant through to consumer had a role to play in that ecosystem issue. And so the way that we faced into that was to get all of those players together. We ran a big experience event where we sort of agreed on the problem, and then agreed on a set of high-level principles to face into that problem. And so the guiding principles that are on this slide still true today, really, that we set out wanting to leverage best practice that we saw in other jurisdictions. We saw strong customer authentication having a key role, and partly because the strong customer authentication brings together those various players in the ecosystem, the merchant, the issuer, the customer, to authenticate and to improve the issue. We needed to be technology neutral, so we were very aware of 3D Secure, but we also wanted to empower merchants to authenticate in different ways and authenticate themselves where they could and where they were sophisticated. And we wanted to build something that was resilient and could adapt over time to what we were seeing in the card not present fraud space. So really, as a result of the ecosystem issue and those guiding principles, we ended up at a simple level, at a high level, really, with two sets of solutions. So one was really to focus in on authentication in, we think, a slightly more sophisticated way than other jurisdictions have done. So we chose not to simply say all transactions over a certain value must be authenticated. We allowed the use of what we termed risk-based analysis, so merchants could essentially make their own decisions around low-risk transactions. So, for example, I may do the same shopping cart every month, in which case that's pretty low risk. But when I suddenly do much higher value, or my location has changed or something like that, then that's high risk, and that's where the merchant may choose to authenticate. We chose to, on the back of that risk-based analysis, really suggest that strong customer authentication was best practice. But we also chose to exempt some transactions, and again, that sort of factors into both of those previous points. So where a transaction's recurring, my Netflix subscription, for example, I've authenticated the first time I've done it, I don't need to authenticate moving forward. Or where I'm a trusted customer, the merchant has dealt with me lots of times, again, for a similar shopping cart, that's fine. Or where it's a wallet, where I'm being authenticated through a different means, potentially a biometric, every time I use that wallet, then again, those are exempt. And crucially, they're exempt from the next pillar of what we brought in, which is a set of fraud thresholds. So we set both value and volume thresholds for both issuers and merchants. We can do that in our self-regulatory role. We self-regulate in the card space, both issuers and acquirers, and through the acquirers, therefore, we can apply those thresholds to their merchants. Effectively, what that does is say, here's a maximum amount of fraud that you should be experiencing as a dollar value relative to your sales. And if you breach that, then it forces a set of actions. So the first set of actions may be that you need to increase your fraud monitoring. The second may be that you need to introduce strong customer authentication that, if you're a merchant, could be your own. strong customer authentication. But if you continue to breach, then you really need to be using someone else in the ecosystem to help you. So that's where authentication to issuer would come in. And ultimately, if you continue to breach, then there's a financial cost. So we have the right to sanction both issuers and acquirers under the framework. So we think that is, as I started out by saying, Armin, somewhere in the middle of your schema of is it regulation or is it not? It's self-regulation, and we might talk later as to how effective that's been over the last few years.
That's very interesting that you mentioned some of those exemptions as well. You mentioned trusted customers. We see also in PSD2 the trusted merchants, which are functionalities that have been added, and the risk engine that helps you basically measure or monitor the risk of the transaction is quite an interesting one. You mentioned recurring payments, and I think when it's a subscription with the same amount, that's something that's already taken care of within the specifications. I think there's the variable recurring payments, which is always a little bit of a challenge when you see variations on the amounts over the course of time.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Our framework does recognise the fact that recurring payments can change and puts a parameter around those. So it sort of goes beyond the current specification, but it's also an area, and looking at this slide now, you'll come on to this, Armin, but it's an area where we recognise we were setting a framework together back in 2019 that we wanted to future-proof. So we wanted to be able to adapt it. So that kind of room to move as the specifications are enhanced is really important. And by the way, we review the framework every year as well, which means that it stays fit for future.
Which is great for us as well, because we get the great insights on how we can further improve the specification. and it's a great segue to go to the slide that you have on the webinar right now, which is going through exactly those enhancements that we've decided to add to the specification to address some of those feedback that we've been receiving. And those enhancements include the flexibility on how you can implement this across multiple channels and devices, as we see people are using not just the computer, but they're using increasingly their mobile phones or tablets in order to make online shopping in the convenience of their sofa or on the move as they are commuting. But the next level that we decided to look at is gaming consoles and smart speakers and smart devices that have lower computational power. And some of the enhancements that enable those functionalities are the split SDK, for example, where we have a lighter version that runs on the device. And we've leveraged quite significant amount of feedback and support from those gaming consoles providers like Sony PlayStation and the Microsoft Xbox teams that have provided quite good insights on what would be useful in order to enable the stronger authentication coming from those non-traditional channels. We also had different industries that have provided feedback, like IATA, on adding some payment data elements that could help assess the veracity of the transaction that is coming in for travel-related transactions. So these are all added in the latest enhancements of our 3D secure specification. Now, beyond those industry-specific inputs, we also have a joint work that we've kicked off in 2019 to enhance the interoperability of the technologies beyond EMVCo. And that's key to businesses, merchants, and consumers to deliver a convenient shopping experience. And And here we can see some of the great work that's coming out of the Web Payment Security Interest Group that we've been working on together with the FIDO Alliance and W3C. One of the benefits that we see coming out of this is various improvements, such as the secure payment confirmation. You will see very shortly a press release with regards to its adoption. So it's basically working jointly with FIDO authenticators and EMV3DS flow to better validate the legitimacy of a transaction and reduce the risk of fraud. And the reason why we've looked at these various supports like web authentication and the use of the authenticators provided by the FIDO Alliance is how to automate some of those consumer transactions to minimize friction and improve the payment experience. We also have added the automated out-of-band transition. Hans-Peter mentioned earlier, and Andy mentioned the use of the in-app authorization. If you have to actually click in order to go between applications on your handset, every click merchant will tell you is an opportunity for a card abandonment. And having this automation for the authentication step is extremely helpful because it reduces 2 steps in the process and allows you to be able to authenticate and remove further friction. And the user interface improvements are also key because it provides more control and more flexibility in the messages that can be used to be displayed rather than having to go from a merchant environment all the way to an issuer environment. You stay in the merchant environment and you display the information that is necessary within that window. Again, it removes friction and confidence for the consumer that he's doing a suitable transaction. So in March this year, we have decided to renew the charter for the Web Payment Security Interest Group, WPSIG, for another 2 years. And looking ahead, we are looking at how we can protect the privacy of the consumers. As you see, the browsers are moving towards keeping more of the privacy of the consumers, which is actually bringing some friction for the merchants because they can't necessarily follow the consumers through the web interfaces as easily as before. But how do we keep that consumer privacy while ensuring convenience and seamless e-commerce checkout experience? So these are the challenges that we are working on and discussing within the group. And 3DS has also implemented additional data elements to support SPC for the strong customer authentication. And these are the discussions that we will be seeing going forward. Back to you, Greg.
Thanks, Armin. So now we're going to hand over to Andy. We're going to look at how card fraud has changed over time in Australia. Andy.
Thanks, Greg. So this answers the question that I guess I raised previously as to whether the framework that we put in place has worked. And the good news is it has. So we've taken card fraud down pretty significantly from sort of around 75 cents per $1,000 spent to around 58. And that's been significant, and in part because, of course, what has happened during that time is that total card spend, which is the teal line that we see has gone up significantly, and particularly, of course, during COVID. Armin made the point that everybody was at home, including the fraudsters, during COVID. Obviously, e-commerce significantly grew during that time. So, and I probably should have said earlier, when we established the framework, actually our goal was twofold. One was to reduce card-not-present fraud, but the second one was to actually grow e-commerce. So we recognised the point that Armin just made, that you don't want to reduce card fraud in a way that impacts on merchants and means that you're adding friction to their sales. So hence having that dual goal. So we've succeeded. We want to go further and reduce it further still, but we are making it a lot more difficult for the fraudsters, which is great to see.
Okay, Andy, I see. I mean, you talked about COVID, and of course there were a number of weird factors that hadn't been seen before then. But you brought card fraud down, and now card spend is increasing significantly again, while card fraud is still slightly down. Do you think that's sustainable in the long term?
I think it is. I think we might touch on this later, but I think tokenization will be the game changer here. I think if tokenization is widely implemented, then for all sorts of reasons, including that point I made earlier about large data breaches, large data breaches cease to be relevant if the data is tokenized. I think actually we can make even more of a dent in this longer term, Greg.
Okay, thanks. Right, let's move on. EMV offers a number of tools to combat payment card fraud. Let's go over to Hans-Peter to explore how the different EMV technologies are being used to secure online payments today.
Yes, Greg, thank you. If we take Europe as an example with PSD2 regulation, I think it's safe to say that we see that EMV 3DS has played a very important role in reducing fraud. The PSD2 or Payment Services Directive 2 has certainly supported the acceptance of EMV 3DS and the strong customer authentication. On one hand, it gave the market participants the clarity and the guidelines what should be used and how to authenticate. It also mandated the strong customer authentication with a different factor. Well, on the other hand, to be really fair, there were certainly a material number of market participants which would not use it if it was not mandated. So it was also a certain pressure there. But the question is certainly also if mandates are the right measure here. In any case, as a matter of fact, it helped for the coverage and reduced fraud. Similarly to what Andy has said before, some rules help. If it's now mandated with PSD2 or the rules Andy has pointed out in the Australian market, it helps to reduce fraud. In Europe, or rather in the European Economic Area, EMV 3DS is the trusted solution for an e-commerce authentication. The SCA, as we see here on the symbols, which is something you are, the fingerprint in this case can be any biometrics, of course, something the password, PIN, or whatever it is, something you own. In this case, we have a mobile phone that actually 2 out of 3 will make sure we have a proper authentication. As a result, 100% of e-commerce transactions are authenticated in Europe.
Sorry.
Yes.
Let me know when you finish. I've got a question for you.
Okay. In the meantime, EMV 3DS has an excellent performance in Europe with a high conversion rate. Netcetera customers are looking at the conversion rate of 80 to 90% in average. And one very important topic of this whole success is certainly also the liability shift. With EMV 3DS, we managed to have the liability on the issuer, who knows the risk the best. With increasing number of data points collected on the merchant side, and also, of course, a sophisticated risk-based assessment. So again, similar to what Andy said, a lower loss rates can be achieved. I think that's it for me. Yes, Greg, if you have a question, please.
Yeah. I mean, very interesting what you were saying here. I mean, the introduction of SCA under PSD2 in Europe generated incredible amount of negative feedback from merchants in Europe, and the deadline, in fact, was pushed back several times. I think part of that was because merchants weren't ready, but a lot of it was negative feedback. Merchants and the processors claim that SCA would cause consumers to abandon purchases due to additional authentication requirements. But in actual fact, I mean, nobody would wish regulation on any market, but actually, would you say overall it's been successful and is being successful?
It was a bumpy road, to be fair.
Bumpy road, right. But
yes,
3DS certainly played a major role in smoothing that bumpy road, I would say.
Yeah. Well, the major question here is what is successful? So is it successful if we have no fraud? We have seen some statistics from Australia where we see a certain level of fraud is acceptable. Is the solution absolutely no friction? Well, there is always some friction. The goal of EMV 3DS is not to eliminate friction completely. The least friction we would have without authentication at all, right? What you just said, Greg, 3DS only caused issues in the beginning. Only with the measure described before, with this risk-based approach, only transactions with elevated risks are challenged. This has certainly led to a lower abandonment rate, but not without friction. But this level of friction we could accept because it's then really focused on those transactions which are actually high risk or medium high risk. When we come back to APAC, we also need to see that challenges are mandated, for instance, in India, Malaysia, or Singapore. No matter what transaction it is, in this market, frictionless means quick and easy challenge, but challenge is anyway there. I think at the bottom line is, yes, it was bumpy, but we made our experiences and we should use them and not make the same mistakes once again, and make it better in the APAC market.
Okay, good.
Sorry,
let's move on.
A little bit of insight into this. I think one of the interesting points that you may want to see is the evolution of the adoption of the EMV 3DS specification between 2019 and 2023. And as you will see, the level of complaint has gone down significantly as people moved to the SCA compliant version of the EMV 3D Secure. And a lot of the feedback or negative feedback that's been heard were mostly related to those that were still on the very old version of the EMV 3D Secure. And even today, some of the functionalities that are really useful in enabling fighting fraud, like risk-based, like benefiting from the exemptions or the trusted lists and things like that, are still not used by many people, and technology vendors that are implementing those functionalities and helping their merchant customers and users to leverage these functionalities make a key difference, I think, in that sense.
I completely agree what you just said, Armin. I didn't want to leave the impression that the standards as such were wrong in the beginning, or that did not improve or evolve, if that was the impression. My point is, I mean, look back, at some point we said, yeah, well, 3DS, that's a mandate. Let's do it the most simple way we can. Exemptions, let's look at it later. Come on, that's not that's I don't understand this expression anyway. Let's look at it when it comes and these kind of things. And exactly those little differences, if we had looked at those in the beginning, because they were there from early on, it would have been a less bumpy ride in the end. And I think these kind of experience we can bring to the table here.
Okay, good. Well, look, let's move on slightly quicker because we've got some questions in the chat, and they're good questions, and I want to get to those in the Q&A. So back to you, Hans-Peter. Off you go.
Yes. So let's go to the 3D secure authentication. What you see here is the 3D secure authentication journey. Please do not take the arrows as data flows here. We simplified it just for a simpler understanding. The journey starts, of course, with the card holder, top left, pressing the pay button, which was mentioned several times now on the browser or on the app. Larger merchants would initiate the 3D secure journey right away from there. However, most merchants will make use of the service of a payment solution provider with a payment gateway. And the payment gateway, as you can see here, will initiate the 3D secure journey using the 3DS server we provide as a source. This component is fully compliant with all the international scheme networks and increasing number of domestic schemes handy. I think officially as of today, also EFT POS is on the domestic schemes list here of Netcetera. So we're increasingly also support with this the local schemes. Then a few things a merchant or a payment gateway has to take care of themselves is topics like PCI DSS, EMVCo compliancy. Well, I'm not saying this to point out how good we are, but as a matter of fact, these are things we do for a large number of customers worldwide. And this 3D server you can see here, or on the other hand, the ACS, the issuer part of the whole story. And since a few months also the directory server. This is what we can offer and make this journey easier for the PSBs, for the acquiring bank, the schemes, but also the issuer. Before we move to the next slide, yeah, you're faster than me. Let's please wait with the animation. As I mentioned earlier, there is an alternative to the very prominent use of SMS in the region. This page we see here shows authentication using an out-of-band. First, we will see a demo shop for checkout, where we fill out the credit card information, assuming a guest checkout. The banking app will open to confirm, authenticate the transaction with one click. Can you please start the animation? Yes, here's the shop. I'm gonna buy some flowers here in the shop. Go to the checkout, enter my credit card details. Again, this is a guest checkout. When I push pay, it opens the banking app, or in this case, a white label app we support as pre-integrated. It opens automatically, so it's seamless here. I can choose accept or deny for this transaction, and the transaction is already authenticated and the purchase is successful. So that's the full journey, the full 3D secure journey, including friction. This is with friction, with a challenge, and it was all seamless. Let's go to click and pay. Click and pay on the other side, that's a bit earlier, before we press checkout. So if you see in the middle, there is this sign, C with two arrows. This is the click to pay icon. And as you can see here, this is supported by all major schemes, this click to pay here. If we quickly go to see the largest here where we have the note enroll during checkout. So the first time you hit this button on a merchant site that supports click to pay, you can enroll during checkout. You enter your information, credentials here on the page and enroll. This again has nothing to do with 3DS at this point. This is the initial enrollment. So now if you go to the same shop or even to another shop, you will see something like the picture on the right. Select the card you want to pay with. So after entering an OTP, you're automatically recognized, and the list of cards you have already enrolled is shown, and you can choose one and click and pay with it. You can go a step further. If you accept cookies, the shop will immediately recognize you, and without even OTP will show you the cards, and you can choose one and for process from there on. Now the enroll during the checkout, this is something that there is also an alternative. The issuer can of course push provision this click to pay. This would then mean that the issuer would integrate a push provisioning in the issuing app or in the wallet and push this to the click to pay, and this whole enrollment would not be necessary. So far to click to pay. Then we go to network tokenization. I try to speed up a little bit here. If we look at it, the network tokenization, everything looks a bit familiar in a way. We have the same players here with the card holder, with the PSP gateway, with the card issuer. Now we have two new components here, the token requester and the token service provider, also known as schemes in this context. So in the past, PSPs have often offered the possibility to have PSP tokens, and this was how the card was stored on file. With this tokenization of the networks, this is now pushed to the token service providers. Now you have two choices. On one hand, you can integrate as a PSP or gateway to all the different service providers, or you can make the use here of a token requester and just ask for a token. And the token requester will find out where the token lies and present this to the PSP gateway. What we see in the reality is that PSP tend to stick to the PSP tokenization because they are a little bit afraid of the effort to switch all their tokens, to switch all their merchants to the new network tokens. This can easily be solved because PSPs can keep their PSP tokens and just map it to the network tokens. So why would you do that? Why would you have two tokens here? Well, the big disadvantage of PSP tokens by itself is that we have use cases where a card gets stolen, replaced, renewed. Maybe the plastic is damaged or whatever. In such cases, the PSP will not immediately notice or will not notice that this card is not valid anymore. The next time the card holder will try to pay, the card is not valid anymore, and it causes friction because a new card, a new PAN has to be entered in the shop. When we use network tokenizations, I mean the schemes, they know the use case and they will map the new physical card to this token, and it's actually transparent for the PSP or merchant and the card holder if there is a replaced card in the background. as of today, we know that a large rate of cards card on file with PSP tokens is invalid, and this is a real issue on that end. What you should not forget in the whole story here with this network tokenization, the card is already tokenized with the network. So tentatively, when it comes to the payment, there is a higher chance that this is frictionless. Now, this is one aspect of the whole journey. So it's not that if it's tokenized, it's frictionless, but there is a higher chance to have a frictionless journey here. Yes, that's pretty much the tokenization.
Okay, thanks, Hans-Peter. So probably the most important question of this webinar: what lessons can organizations in APAC learn from specification implementations in other geographies? So we're going to have another quick poll here, ladies and gentlemen, to get your feedback on that. Can we bring that up? And so the poll, here we go. What do you think is the main priority to address fraud in Asia? Do you think it's legislation, which includes regulation, legislation and regulation? Do you think it's authentication solutions? Do you think it's more transparency? Or do you think it's something else? So let's open the poll now, and we're going to give you about 20 seconds to make your choices. Then we're going to come back and look at that. Right, so another 10 seconds or so, looking at what do you think is the main priority to address fraud in Asia. And okay, I think we can close that poll and look at the results. Okay, so overwhelmingly, people think authentication solutions are the way to go. And a close second is legislation and regulation, which is only 36%. The authentication solutions get 61%, and that really dominates the entire poll. So everything else is by the wayside. Okay, that's interesting. Let's move on to the next and the last couple of slides. So we go back to Hans-Peter.
Yes, so what do we see in APAC? So very generally, legislation, yes, the regulation in APAC countries is very different. Mostly we have national rules from very strong mandates for 3GS with mandatory challenge or tokenization for all cards to very liberal regulation with recommendation only. The question again is, of course, if mandates are the right thing to do. In other regions, it helped to have some standards and reduce the fraud. One big thing that also I've seen the same just before in the question before in the survey, risk-based authentication. For some countries with the mandate for challenges, the RPA seems to be of no value at first spot. However, RPA is not just the decision if challenge is needed or not. It sometimes, of course, also denies transactions. So even in these regions, a really, really good risk-based authentication can save a lot of fraud. Still, we see some reluctance. This might also be the result of the current discussion about AI, where nobody knows what's happening and why. I would say most of the RBAs in the market, also ours, is a combination of human and artificial intelligence here. Then 100% authentication, yes, that's really something we see more here, that this is mandated, but still, again, still with SMS and email. One point is transparency. Here we see in the region that merchants sometimes perceive the authentication as black boxes, or even worse, as a trial and error. They have the feeling that authentication is not transparent, maybe also because there is no regulation. In one country in APAC, the approval rates drastically dropped with the introduction of 3DS 2.x. And merchants are increasingly frustrated about their lost profits, and they don't even know why. Then the SMS, yes, Greg, you wanted to mention something?
I was just going to say, we've talked a bit about SMS and SMS fraud. Let's go straight on to the last 2 points.
Yeah, I agree. So
there. And I'm particularly interested in the regulation. What were you going to say about regulation there?
Okay. So the adoption is very simple. That's the good news. The adoption is very high. Let's go to regulation. Japan is considering a mandate for strong customer authentication, similarly to Europe. So there are countries which come up with SCA now.
Okay. Go on to the next slide, please. Andy, you're going to give us some lessons learned.
I'll be really quick. So as I said earlier, risk-based analysis I think is fundamental here. Hans-Peter just mentioned it. This isn't about zero friction. Customers will actually understand friction where it's for good reason. It's a high value. It's a high risk set of goods. But we need to weigh up customer experience as well. And as I said earlier, tokenization will be the real game changer here. If we can stop sharing the data itself and share tokens, then we'll significantly reduce the fraud.
Okay, good. Next slide.
Thank you. I think I'm going to go relatively quickly over the lessons learned. I think we've heard a lot about different technologies, but at the end of the day, the technical capabilities is one aspect to the question, but the real benefit is the bartering of information that can happen between the issuer and the merchant. And the better that information is going to be, the less friction we will see and the less challenge will be raised. And that cross collaboration between different stakeholders is critical for the benefits of the remote commerce and the risk-based decisioning. And this is basically a call out for the wider industry collaboration, as we see the significant improvements that were made to the specification based on the use cases and the inputs is basically an extension to that invitation for you to check our website on how you can get involved and keep that improvement going.
Okay, good. So now we're in the audience Q&A, ladies and gentlemen. By the way, I'm going to probably extend the webinar by 5 to 10 minutes to see if we can get through the questions. And we've got a number of them here. So here's the first question that came up, and this is a relatively new case for EMV payment cards. The question asks, what is the most common fraud in using EMV cards as transportation payments? I'd like to ask if you can share some global best practices to combat this type of fraudulent activities in using EMV payment cards in transportation payments for getting on transit buses and so on. Any comments from our panelists?
I'm happy to lead on that, Greg. We actually did one of our roles is on a transport framework, which several of the states in Australia have picked up, and we did a lot of work with the UK on their transport framework in New Zealand as well. I think the interesting bit here is that fraud is actually a lot lower on EMVCo cards when they're used in transit than if you compare it to closed loop frameworks. And actually, it's a driver for some. It's one of the drivers for some transit operators to move away from closed loop solutions because they will reduce their fraud. The reason for that is that you think about the fraud types that you can have on both sets of cards, including EMVCo cards, and it's the same card being used multiple times. Often that can be quite pure in the EMVCo implementation, because if you try and tap on twice, you actually tap on and tap off and you have to start again, so you can't have two people using the same. same card. And often the other one is where I deliberately keep my balance low so that I'll be allowed out of a station. And for safety reasons, I have to be allowed out, but I may not have paid the full fare. Now, if you think about that with a closed loop solution, actually people will deliberately game the system. They'll deliberately keep a low value on it. That's why some transport operators charge for the card itself. And they'll particularly do that if they're traveling to somewhere that comes at a premium. So someone like traveling to the airport in a lot of jurisdictions costs you more than just traveling between regular stations. So I'll pay the minimum, go out of the exit gate at the airport, and then just throw the card away. You're not going to do that with an EMVCo card. So actually, it's a big reason for the move to using your own debit or credit card rather than using a closed loop system.
Okay, that's interesting because the merchants concerned here, who are actually transport operators and transit authorities, a lot of them around the world are very concerned about this. They worry a lot about first ride risk, which obviously was not the case in Australia.
Well, first ride risk is definitely a thing to factor in, but I think it just needs to be weighed up against the current fraud numbers that you're facing in the closed loop system, and I think actually it sort of largely pales into insignificance. And the reason it does that obviously is because you've got a long-lasting relationship. You're creating a relationship with the consumer and their issuer, and that's what the nature of a credit or a debit card is, rather than it could be a one-off transaction with a closed loop system. As I say, I just choose to throw it away and then go and buy a new one when I need another one.
Right. So good. Thanks, Andy. Next question. Does payment card tokenization still require the CVV and a card expiry date? Who wants to take that one?
I'll probably answer this one. It's going to be a very quick answer, but the whole point of the tokenization is to not rely on static data and rely mostly on the dynamic cryptogram validation. So the issuers will not need that kind of information, and the dynamic linking is important.
Okay, good. Thanks, Armin. The next question. Somebody is asking, have you seen much adoption of SRC or 3D Secure in Vietnam? Hans-Peter?
Yeah, maybe I can take this up. That is the short and the longer answer. The short answer is no. The longer answer is yes, they're ready for it, and there can be a larger adoption expected, but as of today, it's on a rather low level. They have many other means of payments, and this might be one of the reasons. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Next question. Got a question here. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely about fraud, but the question, I'm not sure this e-commerce is, how can biometric fingerprint cards possibly be used to combat card present fraud in Asia? It's a bit off topic, but you want to say anything about that?
I can chip in if you like, Greg. I mean, it's a way of authenticating a customer. It's similar to, I guess, using a biometric through a digital wallet. The question there is it the most effective way? And obviously, biometric cards come at a cost of issuance, so it needs to be weighed up against, for example, enabling your customers to have their card in a digital wallet and using the biometric that comes on a phone instead.
I mean, that is something that EMVCo is doing some work on, but we should come back to that at the end if you like.
For card not present, probably the FIDO authenticators that you may have on your device is something that you can leverage through the SPC and the work we've done with WPC to do the authentication via 3DS rather than the biometrics on card.
But why would you have an additional card if you have the device ready, right? The whole point, I think, was that we have less cards in our pockets.
Yeah, it's difficult to get rid of cards. I think it'll take a while. Let's go on to the next question, and this one's for Armin. Armin, the question's asking you, in markets where every e-commerce transaction is challenged for factor authentication, How do you see merchants and issuers can still benefit from additional data elements introduced in the newer version of 3D Secure protocol? I think, Armin, you could go for this first, and then we could bounce it back to Hans-Peter.
I believe that the most important part of those additional data elements is to give confidence to the issuer that of the veracity of the transaction that is happening. So the more information that you can provide, the more and the better the authorization rate is going to be. And beyond that is basically the risk base is always something that is going to be beneficial for the wider industry.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Armand. This is, as I said earlier, it's not a black and white. It's not a challenge or not a challenge. It's also the question, the more data you have, the higher chances are in those markets that the challenge is actually requested instead of denying right away.
Okay. Just do a few more questions. What's the take-up with SRC so far?
With the EMV Secure Remote Commerce, I think there is quite a fair bit of adoption that we have seen in different regions. And also the fact that most of the global payment systems are onboarding onto it. But I think the most interesting aspect of the interest that I can see is that domestic or regional payment systems are also interested to onboard on it because it brings additional benefits. So we see quite a fair bit of movement in Europe. One of the things that probably is important to highlight is the fact that we provide specifications that are royalty-free for people to use and implement. But we don't get too much involved in terms of their implementation. And also there is no mandate. So basically it's the market need that is going to drive the adoption of those technologies.
It's I can say that maybe in Eastern Europe we have a really large customer that has also thousands of merchants in the background. So yes, there we see some traction. We see a lot of interest in the Indian market as well as in the Australian market. And once again, there is a little bit of incentive here with the card networks discounts for merchants that actually offer this. So there can be some push as well from all the sides, yes.
Do you think the key to reducing card payment fraud, I would have thought, should be combining these tools, EMV, 3D Secure, SRC, and payment tokenization. Have you got any, suggestions or guidelines on what implementers should be doing? Should they, to tie them all together?
I would say so, yes. Yes, I would say so. So it depends a little bit on the type of customers. There might be some more interest in one or the other topic, but definitely it's contributing to implement all and combine all these three elements. I think that was also a reason why we made the choice today to present these through three specifications here. Definitely, they go well together, and you're addressing a much larger audience then with guest checkouts, but also card on file. And I mean, 3D Secure is just a must. That's the base. That's the foundation. Yeah.
Okay. Another question: what is the advantage of risk-based assessments in 3D Secure?
Balance the friction versus the fraud. So risk-based assessment allows issuer issuer to optimize or adopt the risk to the risk appetite. So there might be an issue that is willing to take a little bit more risk on the fraud side and has more business with less friction, and there might be there are certainly issues which are a little bit more cautious and have a little bit less revenue on the other side, a higher friction. So it's actually now to the issuer to decide what is my risk appetite and then execute. And pretty much we have seen with the introduction of RBAs with our customers that some of them established a fraud team that actively day by day manages this assessment and optimizes.
Okay.
I think that's an interesting topic, and I would love to hear from Andy when you're looking at the slide you presented and you included risk base in it. What were your thoughts on that?
Yes, yeah, so I guess our point there is it's broader than actually just the specification as well. So risk-based analysis we encourage on both the merchant side and the issuer side. So we've certainly seen more sophisticated merchants who know the customer very well, deciding whether they choose to authenticate that customer or not on the basis of some risk decisions. And again, they've got some pretty sophisticated matrices behind that decision making, and that's we think really helpful. The merchants doing that in the knowledge that they carry that risk if they get it wrong. But then if they choose to ask the issuer to authenticate, then there's the liability shift that goes with that. So I think it's really important from, back to my sort of ecosystem point, it's very important for everybody in the ecosystem to take that risk-based view.
And
okay.
One thing that I would like to highlight on top of this is the quality of the result of that risk-based engine is going to be highly relevant, relying on the quality of the information that's fed into it. And that's why we've been working so diligently on the data elements provided through the EMV specification.
Okay, well, we got through most of the questions. Here's one more from me, playing the devil's advocate. With all of this, which has been great to hear in this webinar, particularly what the changes that 3D Secure is bringing, but why hasn't card fraud reduced more so far? And what do you think will change that, all of you?
I'm happy to start. I kind of gave my answer a bit earlier. I think it's the lack of adoption of tokenization. I think, Greg, you made the point that these things need to be used in conjunction. I think fundamentally, and it's similar to other walks of life that we're dealing with, scams is another example. We've got a data problem here. We've got too much data in the system that we've historically shared, and that therefore can be attacked. And so we need to remove that from the system through tokenization, and then we'll really make a dent in fraud.
Yeah, I mean, that's my feeling as well. I mean, when tokenization first came along, it sort of hit me as, why didn't we do this before? Why are we making all this data available? Let's keep all of it hidden and just use tokens. And people are even using this in other areas now outside of payments. So any other comments from our panelists? If not, I think we will draw the webinar to a close. We are over, but we've had some very interesting questions. Can I just have the closing slide for the webinar, please? So if you've not managed to get your question answered, or you think of a question afterwards, or perhaps you were one of the people who signed up for the webinar, and as often happens to me, you didn't get actually to join it live, and you're now watching it later, and you'd like to submit a question, then by all means, please do so. You can send your questions to EMVCo, to any of the panelists, to Armin, to Andy, to Hans-Peter, details on this slide. You can even send questions to me. I think my own closing remarks is I think this is an important subject. We're going to have to come back to it again to check in with take up of 3D Secure and tokenization and SRC. If you, for those of you who are based in the Asia Pacific region and you'd like to engage with EMVCo directly, then please join us at APSCA's Next Generation Payments Industry Meeting in Kuala Lumpur on 18-19 October, where you will be able to meet Oliver Manahan, Director of Engagement and Operations for EMVCo. He's going to be discussing the latest work from EMVCo on this subject, as well as on biometrics on card. That was a subject that somebody raised in the questions, on tap to mobile, and again back to SRC, That will be at Bank Negara, Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur. This is at the Bank Negara, Malaysia offices on 18-19 October. So if you're interested in card payments, real-time payments, mobile wallets, and even digital currencies, join us there and connect with the EMVCo team there. I think for this point now, all I've got to say is thanks very much to EMVCo for collaborating with APSCA on this. Thanks very much to our panelists who've prepared the slides that went into this. Thanks, Armin. Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Netcetera. And last slide here. If you've got any further questions, you can go to the EMVCo website where you can find all the information about EMVCo. It was great to have you on the webinar, ladies and gentlemen, and we look forward to seeing you again on a future webinar. Or if, as I said, if you're in Asia Pac, join us and EMVCo at the Next Generation Payments event at Bank Negara, Malaysia in Kuala Lumpur in October. See you then. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.